The morning sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the Metro Court suite usually brought a sense of calm to Port Charles, but on this crisp autumn day, it only highlighted the sharp, unforgiving edges of a reality about to shatter. Josslyn Jax stood by the edge of the glass, a lukewarm cup of coffee untouched in her hands, looking down at the quiet ripples of the harbor. Her life had been a series of violent shifts and quiet recoveries, a delicate balance struck between the dangerous pull of the Corinthos Empire and the grounding, sophisticated sanctuary offered by her father, Jasper Jax. Jax had always been her anchor, the man who had flown across oceans to pull her out of harm's way, the constant counterweight to the lawless chaos that seemed to follow her mother, Carly. Even after his departure back to Australia, separated by thousands of miles and a vast expanse of blue, his voice over the phone remained her ultimate safe harbor. Whenever the world in upstate New York grew too heavy with secrets, betrayals, and the ever-present threat of violence, a single conversation with her father could restore her perspective, reminding her of who she was beyond the shadow of Port Charles. The chime of her phone broke the stillness of the room, a sound so mundane that it gave no hint of the devastation it carried. Josslyn reached for the device, expecting a casual text from Trina or an update on her university schedule, but the international country code flashing across the screen immediately set her on edge. It was not her father's direct cell phone number, but rather the formal trunk line of St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, a premier medical facility where Jax had served on the board of trustees and maintained deep philanthropic ties. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a second, a strange, instinctual knot tightening in the pit of her stomach before she pressed the receiver to her ear. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and weighed down by the unmistakable burden of formal condolence. The administrator spoke with a quiet, practiced reverence, carefully navigating the distance and the delicate nature of the news, asking first to confirm that she was indeed Josslyn Jax, the primary legal contact listed on Jasper Jax' international medical proxy. The world seemed to decelerate into a series of disconnected fragments as the administrator began to detail the events of the preceding 48 hours. Jax had been admitted to the intensive care unit following a sudden, catastrophic cardiovascular event, a massive aortic dissection that had occurred without warning while he was attending an afternoon meeting at his corporate offices in Sydney. The medical team had fought heroically, rushing him into emergency surgery in a desperate attempt to repair the vascular tear, utilizing every advanced surgical technique available at the facility. For hours, the surgeons worked under immense pressure, but the complications were swift and severe, leading to widespread systemic failure. The formal voice through the speaker explained that despite the exhaustive efforts of Australia's top specialists, Jasper Jax had succumbed to his condition in the early hours of the morning, passing away quietly in the recovery ward without ever regaining consciousness. The phone slipped from Josslyn's fingers, thudding softly onto the carpeted floor as her mind refused to process the words she had just heard. The immediate physical reaction was a complete shutdown of her senses. The ambient noise of the city below faded into absolute silence, and the room seemed to tilt dangerously on its axis. Her father, the man who seemed larger than life, invincible, and entirely detached from the grim mortality of Port Charles, was gone. He was not coming back on a private jet to sweep her away for a holiday. He would never again call her his little princess or offer his sharp, protective critiques of her life choices. The permanence of death, something she had faced too many times in her young life with the losses of Oscar Nero and Morgan Corinthos, had reached across the globe to claim the one person who represented absolute safety. Carly entered the room moments later, holding a stack of papers, her sharp eyes instantly catching the ghostly paleness of her daughter's face and the dropped phone on the floor. Seeing the sheer terror and hollow emptiness in Josslyn's eyes, Carly dropped everything, rushing forward to grab her daughter's trembling shoulders. Josslyn tried to form the words, but her throat felt constricted, locked in a violent spasm of disbelief and grief. When the truth finally broke past her lips, that Jax was dead, that he had died alone in a hospital in Sydney, the composure Carly maintained as a shield for her family visibly cracked. The shared history between Carly and Jax, built on years of intense love, bitter conflict, and an unbreakable bond forged through their daughter, flooded the room, leaving both women suspended in a shared realm of agony. The news spread through the inner circles of Port Charles like a silent wildfire, striking at the heart of those who had known Jasper Jacks over his decades in the city. At General Hospital, the medical staff who remembered Jacks not just as a prominent figure, but as a devoted father who had once moved heaven and earth to secure a kidney transplant for a dying toddler Josslyn, received the bulletin with profound shock. Dr. Kevin Collins and Elizabeth Baldwin exchanged quiet, sorrowful looks in the nurse's station, recognizing the immense psychological toll this loss would take on Josslyn, a young woman who had already weathered more trauma than most endured in a lifetime. Jacks's legacy in Port Charles was complex, defined by his fierce rivalries with Sonny Corinthos, his business brilliance, and his unyielding commitment to his family, making his sudden demise in a distant land feel surreal and deeply tragic to everyone who had crossed his path. For Josslyn, the immediate hours following the call became a blur of agonizing arrangements and overwhelming grief. She retreated to the balcony, staring out at the gray water, trapped in a vortex of memory. She recalled the smooth sound of his Australian accent, the warmth of his bear hugs, and the way he had always looked at her as if she were the center of his universe. The realization that she would never hear his voice again, that he would not be there to walk her down the aisle, to see her graduate, or to comfort her when her world fell apart, hit her in waves of suffocating pain. The isolation of his death, dying thousands of miles away in an Australian hospital room, surrounded by medical equipment rather than the family who adored him, amplified her heartbreak into something sharp and unbearable. As night fell over Port Charles, bringing a cold wind off the bay, the reality of a world without Jasper Jacks set in with absolute certainty. Josslyn sat curled on the sofa, wrapped in one of her father's old cashmere sweaters that she had kept in her closet, clutching it as if it were a physical tether to his spirit. Carly stayed by her side, holding her hand in silence, setting aside her own complex grief to serve as the pillar her daughter so desperately needed. Yet, beneath the grief, a quiet storm was beginning to brew within Josslyn. The shock was slowly giving way to a desperate, unyielding need for answers, to know every detail of his final hours, to understand why his heart had failed, and to ensure that his memory would be honored in the city he had once called home. The chapter of her life defined by her father's protective presence had closed forever, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters of Port Charles alone with his legacy. The news of Jasper Jacks' sudden death in Australia sent a heavy ripple through the fabric of Port Charles, where the Jacks name carried years of complex history, dramatic rivalries, and deeply rooted personal connections. While Carly and Josslyn remained sequestered in the Metro Court suite trying to absorb the sheer weight of the tragedy, word traveled fast through the corridors of Metro Court Hotel, the PCPD, and General Hospital. For many in town, Jacks was a larger-than-life figure, a dashing, high-stakes corporate tycoon who had matched wits with mobsters and billionaires alike, yet whose fundamental drive had always been protecting the people he loved, especially his daughter. The realization that a man of such vitality and resourcefulness had succumbed to a sudden, silent medical crisis thousands of miles away left the community in a state of solemn disbelief. At the Corinthos estate, Sonny Corinthos sat in his dimly lit office staring at the phone long after he had received the call from Carly. His relationship with Jacks had been legendary in its hostility. For 2 decades, the two men had clashed repeatedly over Carly, Josslyn's safety, and the stark divide between Sonny's criminal empire and Jacks's legitimate corporate world. Jacks had despised everything Sonny stood for, often going to extreme lengths to isolate Josslyn from the violence that shadowed the Corinthos name. Yet, as Sonny poured a drink he had no intention of finishing, any past bitterness was completely swallowed by a profound, somber respect for the father Jacks had been. Sonny knew the devastating agony of losing family, and his heart broke for Josslyn, the young woman he had helped raise as a stepfather, who now had to face a world without her father's guidance. He called Jason Morgan immediately, putting aside all ongoing business matters to ensure that Josslyn and Carly had every resource available, from private air transport to security, as they prepared to navigate the grueling logistics ahead. Inside General Hospital, where Jacks had once played a pivotal, dramatic role during Josslyn's childhood health crisis, the mood was equally heavy. Dr. Portia Robinson and Elizabeth Baldwin spoke in hushed tones near the pediatrics ward. Elizabeth remembered vivid details of the past when Jacks's world revolved around saving his little girl, the desperate days surrounding Josslyn's kidney transplant and the relentless length to which Jax would go to shield his family from harm. In a hospital built on the delicate line between life and death, Jax's passing in a distant Australian medical facility was a poignant reminder of human mortality, striking hard at those who remembered his fierce, noble presence in those very halls. Trina Robinson arrived at the Metro Court within 30 minutes of hearing the news from her mother, rushing straight to Josslyn's side without hesitation. Trina found her best friend sitting motionless on the edge of the bed, staring at an old framed photo of Jax holding a young Josslyn on the beaches of Sydney. Without saying a word, Trina sat beside her and pulled Josslyn into a tight embrace. The silence between them spoke volumes. Trina understood the deep, terrifying sting of loss and knew that no grand speech could fix the vast void left in Josslyn's heart. As Josslyn wept against her friend's shoulder, she began to murmur about the terrible irony of distance, how her father had moved back to Australia to find peace, only for that very distance to rob her of the chance to say a final goodbye, to hold his hand, or to hear his voice one last time. As afternoon turned to evening, the suite became a command center of grief and coordination. Carly took charge of managing the complex international protocols required to transfer Jax's estate affairs and coordinate with his representatives in Sydney, using her formidable strength to handle the administrative burdens so Josslyn could simply grieve. Michael Corinthos arrived shortly after, stepping up to support his sister with the quiet, steady devotion that had always defined their sibling bond. He offered to accompany Josslyn on the long flight across the Pacific to Sydney to claim Jax's personal belongings, settle his local affairs, and oversee his final arrangements. Looking at her brother, Josslyn realized that while the anchor of her childhood had been severed, the family surrounding her in Port Charles would not let her drown in the storm. Soap Opera Digest. Yet, despite the swell of support, Josslyn felt a profound isolation setting in. The phone calls from family friends, the formal condolences from corporate board members across the globe, and the floral arrangements starting to arrive at the hotel desk felt like distant background noise against the thumping realization of her permanent loss. She walked over to her father's old trunk, pulling out a bundle of letters and postcards he had sent her over the years from his travels. Reading his precise, elegant handwriting, she could hear his voice clearly in her mind, offering wisdom, unconditional love, and gentle warnings about the path she chose in life. The painful truth that there would be no more postcards, no more late-night international phone calls, and no more surprise visits settled deep into her soul, closing out the chapters of her youth and thrusting her into a stark, unfamiliar reality as she prepared to make the long journey across the ocean to face her father's final resting place. The private jet sliced through the endless dark sky over the Pacific Ocean, a silent capsule carrying Josslyn and Michael across time zones toward a destination wrapped in grief. Down below, the dark water reflected nothing, matching the hollow emptiness inside Josslyn's chest. Michael slept fitfully in the seat across the aisle, but Josslyn remained awake, her eyes fixed on the flight tracker screen watching the tiny airplane icon slowly creep toward Sydney. Every mile traveled felt like an act of surrender, an acknowledgement that the telephone call had not been a horrifying mistake or a cruel hoax. Her mind raced with unanswered questions about her father's final hours, tortured by the image of him in an unfamiliar hospital room, surrounded by sterile equipment and strangers while his life faded away thousands of miles from the daughter who loved him above all else. When the aircraft finally touched down at Sydney Airport in the early hours of the morning, the golden morning light offered no warmth. A sleek black town car arranged by Jax's estate attorneys whisked Josslyn and Michael through the bustling streets of the city. Sydney was vibrant, alive, and moving at its usual frantic pace, completely indifferent to the fact that one of its most prominent native sons was gone. For Josslyn, the stark contrast between the city's lively rhythm and her internal devastation was jarring. Passing the landmark harbor and skyline, she remembered previous trips filled with laughter, boat rides, and her father's proud tours of his hometown. Now, those same streets felt like a haunting landscape of memories she could no longer share with him. Arriving at St. Vincent's Hospital, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet, somber gravity. The hospital administration had prepared for their arrival, guiding Josslyn and Michael down long, pristine corridors to a private conference suite in the executive wing. There, they were met by Dr. Alastair Vance, the chief of cardiovascular surgery who had led the team during Jax's emergency procedure. Dr. Vance was a tall, silver-haired man whose compassionate demeanor could not hide the profound sadness he felt over the outcome. He sat down with Josslyn, offering a detailed, transparent account of the medical emergency. He explained that the aortic dissection was sudden, massive, and largely asymptomatic until the moment of catastrophe, assuring her that Jax had suffered very little pain before losing consciousness, and that every cutting-edge intervention had been exhausted in the operating room. Hearing the precise medical details gave Josslyn a grim sense of closure, silencing the terrifying suspicion that something preventable had been overlooked. The hardest moment came when the chief administrator escorted Josslyn into the quiet room where her father's personal belongings had been inventoried and stored. Sitting on a small table was a leather bag containing the items Jax had with him on his final day: his gold wristwatch, his wallet, a fountain pen, and his mobile phone. Josslyn reached out with trembling hands, picking up the watch that had been a staple on his wrist for as long as she could remember. It was still set to Port Charles time, a silent testament to how constantly his thoughts had remained anchored to her life back in New York. Turning on his phone, she found that his final outgoing text message, drafted just minutes before his collapse, was a half-finished note to her, expressing how proud he was of her university progress and promising to fly out for a visit the following month. The sight of those unfinished words broke whatever composure she had managed to maintain, unleashing a torrent of tears as she clutched the phone to her chest. Later that afternoon, Josslyn and Michael traveled to the quiet coastal suburb where Jax had maintained his Australian residence, an airy, modern home built on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Walking through the quiet rooms felt like stepping into a sanctuary designed by his essence, minimalist, elegant, and filled with photographs of family. On the mantelpiece, surrounded by awards and honors from his long global business career, were dozens of pictures of Josslyn at every stage of her life: her first steps, her school plays, her soccer games, and recent photos sent from college. Seeing how completely she had occupied his heart, even across an ocean, brought a bittersweet comfort to the sharp edge of her grief. Michael stood quietly in the doorway, giving his sister the space she needed to linger in her father's space, absorb his memory, and begin the agonizing process of gathering his important documents. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting a deep crimson glow across the ocean, Josslyn walked out onto the wooden deck overlooking the water. The cool coastal wind brushed past her face, carrying the salt spray of the Australian sea that her father had loved so deeply. Standing at the edge of the world, she realized that while the tragedy of his sudden death in an Australian hospital would always be a deep scar on her soul, his legacy was not defined by his tragic final hours. It was defined by the fierce, protective, and unyielding love he had poured into her throughout her life. She looked out at the horizon, taking a deep breath of the ocean air, and quietly made a promise to honor his memory by living her life with the courage, dignity, and independence he had always instilled in her. The morning sun rose over Sydney, burning through the early fog and illuminating the quiet, manicured lawns surrounding the memorial chapel where Jasper Jax was to be laid to rest. Inside, the private sanctuary was filled with crisp white lilies and ocean blue hydrangeas, reflecting both the elegance with which Jax had lived his life and the deep Australian waters he had called home. Josslyn sat in the front row, flanked by Carly and Michael, her frame small but resolute against the quiet vastness of the space. Across the aisle were longtime business associates, childhood friends, and representatives from the global charitable foundations Jax had championed over the decades. The service was dignified and understated, exactly as Jax would have wanted, focused not on corporate triumphs or long-standing rivalries, but on the profound impact he had on the people he loved. When Josslyn stood up to deliver the eulogy, a calm settled over her that surprised even Carly. Walking up to the mahogany podium, she looked out at the faces gathered to honor her father and took a slow, steadying breath. She did not speak of Jasper Jax, the corporate raider, the jet-setting billionaire, or the man who had engaged in legendary clashes across the Port Charles skyline. Instead, she spoke of the father who would drop everything to fly across the world just to sit by her bedside when she was sick, the man who taught her how to stand tall in the face of fear, and the unshakable force who had loved her unconditionally through every trial of her youth. Her voice remained clear and unbroken as she shared personal memories, the sound of his laughter echoing across the harbor, his sharp Australian wit, and the quiet promises of protection he had kept until his very last breath. As the casket was lowered into the green hills overlooking the ocean, Josslyn stepped forward alone to place a single white rose onto the polished wood. She whispered a final personal goodbye, releasing the deep weight of immediate shock and stepping into the space of quiet remembrance. The funeral marked the end of an era, but as she stood on that coastal hillside watching the waves break against the shore, she felt a subtle transformation within herself. The devastating news that had shattered her world days ago had matured into a deep sense of duty and determination. She was no longer just the young girl seeking refuge in her father's shadow, she was his daughter, carrying forward his fire, his integrity, and his name into whatever lay ahead. The flight back to New York was marked by a quiet, reflective stillness. Returning to Port Charles, Josslyn stepped back into her life with a renewed sense of purpose that resonated through every hallway of Metro Court and General Hospital. The town had moved on in its usual fast-paced rhythm, yet for those who had known Jax, his absence was a silent monument. Sonny Corinthos reached out in the days following her return, offering a quiet truce and confirming that the security and well-being of Jax's daughter would always remain his personal responsibility, honoring the unspoken respect that had developed between the two men over their shared love for Josslyn. Carly, too, found a quiet peace in seeing her daughter step forward with such grace, knowing that Jax's influence would forever guide Josslyn's path. In the weeks that followed, Josslyn returned to her studies and her life in Port Charles, holding tight to the gold wristwatch and the unfinished text message that remained her father's final gifts to her. The tragic news from St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney would always remain one of the darkest chapters of her story, an unexpected blow that had altered her life forever. Yet, as she looked out over the Port Charles harbor from her balcony in the quiet evening light, she knew that Jasper Jax was not truly gone. He lived on in the strength she displayed, the choices she made, and the unyielding resilience with which she faced the world, carrying the memory of her father across every ocean and through every chapter yet to come.